Brynn Ellery arrived at the Mercer estate, expecting paperwork. Instead, she discovered she had inherited enough power to decide and control a Mafia empire. The Newport property stood above the Atlantic on dramatic cliffs, surrounded by sweeping lawns and old stone walls. Autumn wind bent the grass toward the sea. Gray-blue waves struck the rocks below, and expensive cars lined the circular drive as storm clouds gathered offshore. Brynn wanted no part of the Mercer world. Her late father, Grant Ellery, had once handled corporate restructuring for Silas Mercer, the family's powerful matriarch. Brynn believed that connection had ended years ago. Celeste's death proved otherwise. Her private trust triggered a succession review, and Grant's name appeared inside it. That was why Brynn had been summoned. Inside the mansion, she met Knox Mercer. At 35, Knox already carried the reputation of a man who had survived enough violence to stop proving himself. Broad-shouldered and muscular, with tattooed hands, a light beard, and an unerringly controlled presence. He ran Mercer Maritime while quietly trying to modernize parts of the criminal organization attached to it. His greatest obstacle was his uncle, Silas Mercer. Silas represented the old guard, and Celeste's trust had placed Brynn directly between them. 18% of Mercer Maritime's emergency voting rights had been assigned to an independent trust controlled by Grant. After his death, those rights legally transferred to Brynn. She had never been told. Now her vote was large enough to decide whether Knox or Silas controlled the company during a succession challenge. Then came the clause that made everything worse. The trust gave Brynn only 72 hours to remain an independent holder. If she stayed outside the Mercer family when the deadline expired, the proxy temporarily passed to Silas. If she became immediate Mercer family, the voting power remained under her direct control. Marriage was the fastest legal solution. Knox needed Brynn to become his wife. She refused immediately. She had not spent her life building independence only to become a convenient signature inside someone else's empire. Knox did not romanticize the situation. He made clear that Silas gaining control would endanger Mercer employees, legitimate companies, and now Brynn herself. She assumed it was pressure. Until that evening, the vehicle scheduled to take Brynn away from the estate was struck before it cleared the coastal road. No one was seriously injured, but the damage was too deliberate to misunderstand. Someone already considered Brynn part of the succession war. That realization changed everything. Her father had not left her money. He had left her the power to determine which dangerous man controlled the Mercer future. And walking away would not make her invisible again. By the time the storm reached Newport, Knox had less than 24 hours before Silas gained the proxy. Before midnight, a marriage license was waiting on the table. Brynn Ellery's name was already printed beside Knox Mercer's. Brynn agreed to marry Knox Mercer for one reason. The attack had proven that refusing him would not make Silas forget she existed. But agreement was not surrender. Before she signed anything, Brynn rewrote the terms. 30 days, separate bedrooms, no physical expectations, no access to her personal finances, full access to every legitimate corporate record connected to her voting rights. Her shares would remain hers, and once the emergency succession period ended, she would have the right to terminate the marriage without Knox interfering. Knox accepted. He needed the marriage recognized before Celeste's deadline expired. The ceremony took place quietly inside a Boston courthouse, without flowers, family celebration, or anything that resembled romance. Brynn signed her name. Knox signed beside it. Within hours, Boston business circles knew the feared head of Mercer Maritime had married an almost unknown corporate consultant. Silas lost his temporary claim to the proxy. For the moment, Knox had won. Brynn moved into his Beacon Hill residence because security required it and because the marriage needed to appear believable. The historic townhouse stood along a brick-lined street beneath old trees, its elegant interior filled with fireplaces, tall windows, warm wood, and a private winter garden. Beyond the upper floors, Boston stretched toward the Charles River. Brynn refused to behave like a guest or a hostage. The next morning, she began reading Celeste's trust documents herself. Knox expected questions. He did not expect what she found. Marriage had not transferred Brynn's voting power to him. It had strengthened hers. Celeste had deliberately written the trust so that if the independent holder married into the Mercer family during an emergency succession, that spouse retained direct control and gained veto authority over specific corporate actions. For 30 days, Knox Mercer could not approve several major decisions without his wife. The irony was immediate. He had forced Brynn into his family because he needed her shares. Now she possessed enough legal power to stop him from using them. That was when something shifted between them. Knox was frustrated. Brynn could see it. But beneath the frustration was something far more dangerous. Respect. She turned to the first transaction, awaiting approval. A major port expansion. The numbers looked wrong. Labor costs were inflated. Several contractors appeared to exist only on paper. Money was moving toward companies with almost no legitimate workforce. Knox explained that the expansion had been pushed by older members of the organization and had been waiting for approval before Celeste died. Brynn refused to sign. Knox could have intimidated her. He did not. He studied the same pages again. For the first time, their tension carried something beyond anger. He had expected a temporary wife. Instead, he had married someone willing to challenge him inside his own empire. Brynn followed the contractor records one layer deeper. The block company had been hidden behind 3 corporate names. Its real owner was Silas Mercer. Brynn had been married to Knox Mercer for less than 48 hours when she began dismantling deals powerful men had protected for years. Mercer Maritime Headquarters overlooked Boston Harbor through walls of glass. Winter sunlight moved across the water. Ferries crossed between old brick buildings and modern towers, and shipping cranes rose beyond the docks like steel monuments to the family's influence. Brynn entered as both consultant and legal Mercer spouse. Nobody seemed sure what that meant. Some employees watched her with suspicion. Others treated her like a temporary complication. Silas treated her like an outsider who had accidentally wandered into a world she could never understand. Brynn ignored all of it. She trusted numbers more than reputations. The port expansion she had already blocked contained security expenses far beyond anything a legitimate shipping project required. Several contractors receiving payments had almost no employees, no visible equipment, and no meaningful business history. Knox did not try to disguise what she was seeing. Those companies belonged to the older Mercer structure. He had been trying to reduce their influence gradually without triggering a violent internal split. That distinction mattered to Brynn. Knox was not pretending his world was clean. He was trying to change it without pretending change could happen overnight. She still refused to excuse what remained. Within hours, Brynn used her temporary veto to block 2 more transactions tied to old guard operations. Silas's anger became impossible to hide. Several senior Mercer figures began viewing Knox's new wife as more dangerous than Knox himself. He could have pressured her privately. He did not. Every blocked vote remained blocked. That choice changed something between them. Brynn began respecting the restraint it required. Knox began including her in legitimate strategy meetings, not because the trust demanded her signature, but because her judgment was useful. He saw that she could confront powerful men without borrowing his authority. She saw that he could hear the word no without turning it into punishment. Mayor Mercer noticed a shift as well. She had spent years trying to protect the legitimate side of Mercer Maritime from Silas's influence, and Brynn's presence finally gave those efforts legal force. That evening, the company hosted a formal reception overlooking the harbor. Brynn and Knox had to make the marriage appear convincing. They stood close for photographs. His hand rested briefly against her back. Her expression softened without planning to. The dangerous part was no longer pretending affection existed. It was realizing how little effort the performance required. Later, back at Beacon Hill, an anonymous package waited for Brynn. Inside was a copy of the private 30-day marriage agreement. Only a handful of people had ever seen it. The package also contained courthouse photographs and a marked calendar page. A circle surrounded the exact date their marriage was supposed to end. Knox's security team immediately traced the breach. The document had not come from an outside rival. Security records showed the leak originated inside Knox Mercer's own family residence. Hours after Brynn's private marriage agreement was stolen, the evidence began pointing toward the one person Knox had just started trusting, his wife. Beckett determined the Beacon Hill residence was compromised. forcing Knox to move Brynn, Merrin, and the core security team to secure Cape Cod property. A violent nor'easter battered the coastline. Rain struck the windows in sheets. Waves crashed beyond the dunes, and lighthouse beams swept across the dark water. Inside, warm wooden walls and stone fireplaces did little to soften the tension. Brynn hated being moved without control, but whoever leaked the contract already knew their Boston routines. Then the investigation became worse. The stolen document had been transmitted through a device registered to Brynn's consulting company. More evidence appeared inside her encrypted work files. Taken together, it looked as though Brynn had leaked the agreement herself to weaken Knox before the succession vote. Silas immediately demanded she be removed from every corporate decision. Members of the old guard claimed Knox had become too emotionally compromised to recognize betrayal. Brynn understood the trap. The fake marriage had made her powerful enough to matter. Now it had also made her the perfect traitor. If Knox turned against her, Silas would win without needing another attack. Every piece of evidence pointed toward Brynn. Knox studied it carefully. Then he noticed the problem. It was too complete, too convenient. Instead of isolating Brynn or using his authority against her, Knox gave her access to the investigation. That decision unsettled her more than suspicion would have. For the first time, a powerful man had every reason to distrust her, and chose restraint instead. Together, they reconstructed the breach. Someone had used information from Brynn's company and Mercer Security at the same time. That meant two separate systems had been compromised. Merrin uncovered a repeating access pattern connected to an old Mercer Trust administrator. Brynn traced the administrator directly to Silas. But one problem remained. Someone inside Knox's house still had to provide the physical marriage agreement. Beckett recovered damaged security footage from the night of the breach. A figure entered Knox's study. Knox recognized her immediately. Merrin, for several seconds, even he looked shaken. Brynn refused to accept the easiest answer. She had just watched perfect evidence turn her into a suspect. She would not condemn Merrin using the same logic. The truth proved more complicated. Merrin had removed the contract after realizing someone had already photographed it. She had been trying to identify who accessed Knox's files before the leak spread. The real intrusion happened earlier. Beckett checked the original entry record. The security code used to access Knox's study belonged to someone who should have been impossible to trace. Brynn Ellery, Brynn's dead father. A deeper archive search revealed something even stranger. Hidden inside Silas Mercer's private records was a sealed file Gran had written specifically for Brynn. Brynn returned to Newport, expecting answers about a security code. Instead, she discovered that Knox had not created the trap that forced her into marriage. Her own father had helped design it. The storm had passed by the time Brynn, Knox, and Merrin reached the Mercer estate. Clear Atlantic light covered the cliffs, and powerful waves struck the rocks below the mansion. Silas Mercer's private library was hidden beneath the oldest wing of the house. Brynn Ellery's sealed file waited inside. Brynn opened it herself. The documents revealed that Gran and Celeste had created the emergency voting trust together years earlier. Both had feared the same future. Silas Mercer, eventually trying to seize control of Mercer Maritime. Celeste understood that family loyalty could make every Mercer vote predictable. Grant believed someone outside the bloodline needed enough authority to stop the family when loyalty became more dangerous than reason. He accepted the role of independent trustee. Then he named Brynn as his successor, not because he expected her to join the Mercer world, because he believed she would challenge anyone who tried to control her. Brynn was furious. Her father had placed responsibility for a criminal empire into her future without ever asking whether she wanted it. Knox discovered an equally uncomfortable truth. Celeste had not completely trusted him either. The trust was deliberately designed so that even the future Mercer leader could be stopped. Neither Knox nor Brynn was supposed to possess absolute control. Their forced marriage had accidentally activated a system meant to make them balance each other. Then the archive revealed something darker. Silas had spent years waiting for Celeste's safeguards to weaken. When her health declined, he accelerated the succession challenge. The attack on Brynn had not been intended to kill her. It had been meant to frighten her away before she understood how much power she possessed. Grant's files also contained evidence that Silas had been diverting legitimate maritime funds into violent off-book operations for years. Knox finally understood why his reforms kept failing. Silas had been undermining them from inside the company. For the first time, Brynn and Knox were no longer standing on opposite sides of marriage arrangement. They had the same enemy, and that made the growing connection between them harder to ignore. The approaching end of their 30-day marriage had begun bothering Knox for reasons that had nothing to do with voting rights. Brynn felt the same pull, but that realization frightened her more than the contract ever had. If Knox truly loved her, love could not become another excuse to keep her trapped. Then Brynn found the final memorandum. Once Silas's misconduct was formally established, the emergency marital protections were no longer required. Knox could surrender every legal advantage the marriage gave him immediately. That became the real test. Not whether Knox could force Brynn to become his wife, whether he could let her leave once he wanted her to stay. The next morning, Brynn found the signed papers waiting for her. Knox had already surrendered every legal advantage the marriage gave him. Brynn had expected freedom to feel like victory. Instead, it felt like losing something she had never planned to want. Knox's signed release removed every corporate advantage he received from remaining married to her. Her share stayed entirely hers. Her voting rights remained independent, and if she wanted to dissolve the marriage, nothing in Celeste's trust could stop her. Knox asked for nothing in return. That was what unsettled Brynn most. He had forced a marriage when power demanded it. Now that his feelings had become real, he refused to use power to keep her. Their relationship changed quietly after that. Knox respected every boundary they had established from the beginning. He no longer treated protection as permission to make decisions for her. He gave Brynn space, even when distance clearly cost him. And Brynn began seeing how different he was from a man who had placed a marriage license in front of her at Newport. For the first time, leaving was entirely her choice. That should have made everything easier. It did not. Then Silas launched his final attack. Copies of the original 30-day marriage agreement reached investors, board members, and rival families. The story spread quickly. Knox Mercer had manipulated Celeste's succession trust by marrying the woman who controlled the emergency shares. Silas demanded an immediate shareholder vote. If Knox lost, Mercer Maritime would pass into his uncle's control. Brynn understood the political problem immediately. She had become evidence against Knox. Remaining at his side could make every decision she made look purchased by marriage. So she left the Beacon Hill house. Voluntarily. Knox did not stop her. No guards blocked the door. No legal threat followed. No reminder that she was still technically his wife. Brynn returned to her own apartment and resumed her independent work. For several days, Knox gave her exactly what she had demanded from the beginning: freedom. And the absence of him hurt more than she expected. That became the clearest proof of how much had changed. Brynn had once feared that Knox would never let her go. Now she feared he actually would. Marin contacted her privately with the final documents Grant had collected. They showed Silas diverting legitimate Mercer Maritime funds into hidden operations for years. Payments, false contractors, internal authorizations. Enough evidence to destroy his credibility during the shareholder vote. Brynn studied the files and understood what Silas had misunderstood from the beginning. She did not need to return as Knox Mercer's wife. She could return as Brynn Ellery, independent shareholder, trust holder. The woman Celeste and Grant had deliberately given the power to say no. Silas believed exposing the marriage had removed Knox's strongest weapon. He never understood that Brynn had never been a weapon. On the morning of the decisive vote, Brynn entered Mercer Maritime alone, and in her hands was enough evidence to destroy Silas Mercer. 30 days earlier, Knox Mercer had forced Brynn into his family. Now she returned when nobody had the power to make her stay. The emergency shareholder meeting began inside Mercer Maritime's glass boardroom overlooking Boston Harbor. Ferries moved across the cold water below, while winter sunlight reflected from shipping cranes and old brick warehouses. Knox's leadership was close to collapse. Silas placed the original marriage agreement before the board and used it as proof that Knox had manipulated Celeste's trust for control. Several shareholders turned against him. Knox did not deny what happened. He accepted that Brynn had never wanted the marriage and that he had pressured her into it because a succession crisis made her voting rights essential. He refused to rewrite coercion into romance simply because his feelings had changed later. Silas expected Brynn to remain absent. Then the boardroom doors opened. Brynn entered alone. No performance. No security surrounding her. No attempt to look like the devoted Mafia wife everyone expected. She confirmed that the marriage had begun as a 30-day transaction. Then she revealed what Silas had not anticipated. Knox had already surrendered every corporate advantage connected to remaining married to her. Her shares were independent. Her vote was independent. And Knox had no legal power to force either one. Silas's argument weakened immediately. Then Brynn opened Grant's records. The documents showed years of Mercer Maritime money flowing through false contractors and hidden port operations controlled by Silas. Marin's evidence connected those transfers directly to businesses that funded violent old guard activity. Silas had not been protecting the family. He had been bleeding its legitimate future to preserve his own power. Brynn cast her voting bloc against him. One independent shareholder followed. Then another. Silas lost the succession challenge. But victory created a new crisis. Exposing Silas meant exposing parts of Mercer Maritime, too. Knox could bury portions of the evidence and preserve much of the empire, or release everything and lose businesses his family had controlled for generations. He chose disclosure. Several port holdings were surrendered. Old Mercer companies were placed under investigation. Regulators and authorities began dismantling the financial structure Silas had built. Marin took responsibility for rebuilding what could remain legitimate. Brynn watched Knox sacrifice inherited power rather than protect it with another lie. That choice mattered more than any promise he could have made to her. By nightfall, the 30-day marriage agreement had officially reached its end. Knox gave Brynn the signed dissolution documents. Then he returned the wedding ring. He did not ask her to stay. That was when Brynn understood the marriage had become real in the only way that mattered. Knox loved her enough to accept that she might leave. The following morning, his study was empty. Brynn was gone. The ring remained on his desk. Months after Brynn walked away, Knox learned that freedom had not ended their marriage. It had finally given it a chance to become real. Silas Mercer's power collapsed under the financial evidence exposed during the succession battle. Mercer Maritime survived, but smaller and cleaner than before. Marin took control of daily restructuring. Beckett remained Knox's security chief, and Knox refused to rebuild the empire exactly as he had inherited it. Several criminal income streams were abandoned completely. Brynn returned to her independent consulting career. She kept the Mercer shares Grant had left under her control, but placed strict governance protections around them so no future family dispute could use them the same way again. Knox stayed out of her life unless invited. No surveillance disguised as protection. No security detail she had not requested. No marriage certificate used as an excuse to appear at her door. Their contact returned slowly. Business meetings became occasional dinners. Necessary phone calls became conversations that lasted longer than necessary. Respect had already existed between them. Now trust had room to grow without a deadline hanging over it. One legal detail remained. Brynn had never filed the dissolution papers. Technically, she was still Knox Mercer's wife. Neither of them treated that fact as ownership. Several months later, Brynn returned to Newport. Celeste's Cliffside estate was being transferred into a foundation supporting maritime workers and their families. The place looked nothing like it had the night Brynn first arrived. Bright Atlantic sunlight covered the cliffs. Restored gardens stretched toward blue water. The old mansion no longer felt like the entrance to a succession war. Knox joined her after the final foundation documents were completed. For the first time, nothing required them to remain together. No emergency vote, no Silas, no trust clause, no threat waiting outside the gate. Brynn finally placed the original wedding ring between them. She had not brought it back to end the marriage. She brought it back because that ring belonged to something they could no longer pretend had been romantic. It belonged to pressure, fear, a 30-day arrangement neither of them would choose again. If their marriage continued, it would have to begin from nothing. Knox accepted that, without trying to control the outcome. That was the difference. Brynn realized he had once believed power could keep a person beside him. Now he understood that love meant making the door easy to open. And Brynn stayed anyway. Not because the Mercer trust required it, because she chose him. Celeste's final safeguard suddenly made sense. The family had never needed a perfect leader. It needed someone powerful enough to challenge a man holding power. Brynn had become that person. Then Beckett arrived with news that changed the future again. Several Mercer holdings surrendered during Silas's collapse had just been purchased through an anonymous company. The ownership trail led to a rival family Knox believed had disappeared years ago.